The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the barren highway. Dust hung in the air as the Steel Serpent's biker gang roared onto the scene, their engines growling like predators closing in on their prey. In the center of the encirclement stood Hank, a German shepherd with matted fur and blood streaking his once pristine coat. His breaths came in ragged gasps, and his legs wobbled from exhaustion, yet his eyes blazed with an unwavering resolve. Surrounded and outnumbered, Hank stood his ground, his low growls a defiant warning. The gang jeered and laughed, their voices dripping with arrogance. "Look at this mutt," one sneered, revving his bike menacingly. Another swung a chain in slow circles, letting the heavy links clang ominously. "Bet he thought he could take us on," he mocked, his grin sharp and cruel. Hidden among the dry brush a few yards away, James Harlow crouched low, his heart pounding like a war drum. A former military veteran turned field agent, James had seen countless moments of peril in his career, but the sight of his loyal partner cornered and vulnerable made his blood boil. Rage simmered beneath his otherwise calm exterior, his grip tightening on the pistol holstered at his side. Every fiber of his being screamed in him to act, to rush into the fray, but years of training held him back, forcing him to wait for the perfect moment. From his position, James could see Hank's trembling frame, but he also saw the fire in the dog's eyes. Hank wasn't giving up, not yet. That single look of determination only deepened James's resolve. "Hold on, buddy," he whispered under his breath, his voice low and steady, though his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The gang, overconfident in their numbers, closed in. The biker with the chain stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. He raised the weapon, its weight glinting briefly in the fading sunlight. Hank crouched lower, his muscles coiling despite his evident fatigue, a snarl building in his throat. The other bikers hollered and cheered, their laughter ringing hollow in the vast, empty landscape. James knew he couldn't wait any longer. His hand moved to his sidearm with practiced precision, his mind calculating angles and outcomes. Time seemed to slow as he rose from his hiding spot, his focus narrowing to a single goal, saving Hank. His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos like a blade. "That's enough." The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. James stepped forward, his pistol aimed steadily at the man with the chain. His presence was a stark contrast to their chaos, calm, cold, and lethal. "Step away from the dog," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, the gang hesitated, their bravado faltering as they sized up the man before them. Hank, sensing the shift, straightened slightly, his growls subsiding but his body still tense. James's eyes flicked briefly to his partner, a silent message passing between them, "We're in this together." The man with the chain smirked, attempting to feign confidence. "What are you gonna do, tough guy? There's 10 of us and one of you." James didn't blink. "Then I suggest you start running," he said, his voice ice cold. The tension hung heavy in the air, the setting sun painting the scene in hues of red and gold, as if nature itself held its breath. It was a moment of stillness before the storm, and James was ready to unleash it. The leader of the gang, still gripping the chain, took a menacing step forward. His arrogance was palpable, but the glint in James's eyes made the man falter. James tightened his grip on his pistol, his stance unwavering. "I don't miss," James stated flatly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He wasn't bluffing, and the gang could feel it. One by one, the bikers exchanged uncertain glances, the earlier bravado melting under the weight of James's calm authority. The leader's smirk faltered. "You think you scare us?" he growled, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. He swung the chain lazily, trying to reassert control. "Last warning," James replied, his aim steady. His eyes darted to Hank, who was still holding his ground despite his battered state. James felt a surge of pride and anger, pride for his partner's courage, and fury at the men who had dared to hurt him. The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Finally, one of the bikers muttered, "This isn't worth it, man." Another nodded, their bravado draining as they realized they were no match for the steely resolve of a trained marksman. The leader scowled, but he lowered the chain, spitting on the ground in frustration. "Fine," he snarled. "But this ain't over." He gestured to the others, and the gang reluctantly backed away, their engines roaring to life as they retreated into the dusk. As the bikers disappeared over the horizon, James finally lowered his weapon, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins. He turned his focus to Hank, who was struggling to stay upright. "Easy, buddy," James said softly, holstering his pistol as he approached. Hank's ears perked up at the familiar voice, and his tail gave a faint wag despite his exhaustion. James knelt beside him, his hands gentle as he inspected the dog's injuries. The sight of the dried blood and the bruises ignited a fresh wave of anger, but he forced himself to push it down. "You're tougher than they are," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Reaching into his pack, James pulled out a canteen of water and a first aid kit. "Let's get you patched up," he said, his tone soothing. Hank licked his hand weakly, a gesture of trust and gratitude that nearly broke James's composure. As James worked quickly to clean and bandage the wounds, the bond between man and dog was palpable. They had faced danger together countless times before, but this felt personal. "You did good, Hank," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You always do." With the last of the bandages secured, James carefully lifted Hank into his arms. The dog didn't protest, resting his head against James's chest, his trust in his partner absolute. James carried him back toward the safety of their truck, each step fueled by determination. As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, James placed Hank gently onto the passenger seat, wrapping him in a blanket. He took one last look at the empty road before sliding into the driver's seat. "We'll make them pay," he promised, his voice low and resolute. The engine roared to life, and James drove into the night, his focus unshaken. This wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. James parked the truck at a secluded spot just outside of town, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over the quiet surroundings. Hank lay wrapped in his blanket on the passenger seat, his breathing steady but his eyes alert, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. James leaned back against the seat, exhaustion tugging at his body, but his mind refused to rest. He couldn't shake the memory of the gang's sudden retreat. It wasn't just his pistol that had rattled them, something else had spooked them, and James needed to figure out what. As he rummaged through his bag for fresh water for Hank, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic. Frowning, James pulled it out and held it up to the light. A USB drive. His brow furrowed. He didn't remember packing this, and its appearance felt out of place. Turning it over in his fingers, he noticed faint scratches on the surface, as though it had been hastily concealed or handled roughly. "Hank," James murmured, glancing at his companion. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his name, though he remained still. James's gut told him this was no ordinary find. He climbed out of the truck and walked around to the back, setting up his laptop on the tailgate. The screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. James inserted the USB drive into the port, half expecting it to be empty, or worse, corrupted. The drive's contents loaded instantly. A single folder appeared on the screen, ominously labeled Project Eclipse. "What the hell?" James muttered, clicking on it. Inside, a series of files populated the screen, encrypted documents, scanned images of what appeared to be blueprints, and a handful of audio recordings. James's pulse quickened as he opened one of the files, a spreadsheet filled with coded names and dates. It didn't take long for James to realize the implications. These weren't ordinary files. They were detailed plans, names of individuals, and transactions tied to something much larger than the gang. He recognized a few of the names, powerful figures from various industries and government offices. Whatever Project Eclipse was, it was big, too big for a biker gang to be acting alone. James's mind raced as he scanned through the information. The bikers must have been couriers or enforcers, tasked with keeping this information hidden. But why had the drive ended up in his possession? Had someone planted it on him, knowing he would investigate? Or had it been sheer coincidence during the scuffle? One file caught his attention, Phase 3, Priority Targets. Opening it, James froze. His name was listed near the top, alongside several others, journalists, whistleblowers, and former law enforcement officers. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a random attack on him and Hank. This was part of a calculated effort to silence anyone who might expose the truth. "Hank," James whispered, his voice low but charged with determination. He closed the laptop and pocketed the USB drive, his mind already racing with his next steps. He looked at his loyal companion, who had pushed himself upright despite his injuries. "Looks like we've got a bigger fight on our hands," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. But they messed with the wrong team. James climbed back into the truck, the USB drive safely tucked into his jacket. As he started the engine, his resolve hardened. He didn't know who was behind this, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth and brought them down. James drove through the winding backroads, his mind churning with the weight of the USB drive's revelations. The small device felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the burden of the truth itself. The files were a roadmap to something dark, something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. He reached out to an old friend, Claire Hamilton, a former investigative journalist who had gone underground after exposing corruption within a prominent corporation. If anyone could help him decode the encrypted files and piece together the conspiracy, it was her. Arriving at Claire's remote cabin nestled deep within the forest, James knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the wood with urgency. Claire opened the door cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning his face before softening at the sight of him. "James," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here at this hour?" James didn't waste time. He pulled out the USB drive and handed it to her. "I found this. It's connected to the gang that attacked me and Hank. There's something big going on, Claire, bigger than I've ever seen. I need your help." Claire took the drive, her expression shifting to one of focused determination. She led James to her workspace, a cluttered desk surrounded by monitors, maps, and files. Sliding the USB into her computer, she began sifting through the data. As the hours passed, Claire unraveled layer after layer of encryption, her expertise peeling back the secrets hidden within. Each discovery made their hearts pound harder. The files pointed to a covert operation called Project Eclipse, an initiative involving key players across industries, biotech, defense, and energy. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. "They're consolidating power," Claire muttered, scrolling through a series of emails. "These people, they're funding black ops, sabotaging competitors, even orchestrating political coups. And look at this." She pulled up a list of recent incidents, fires, disappearances, and mysterious deaths. Each event was linked to individuals who had stumbled upon pieces of the conspiracy. James clenched his fists as he realized just how far-reaching the web was. "Here," Claire said, pointing to a blueprint. "This looks like a research facility. It's heavily encrypted, but I think it's tied to something biological. They're testing something." James leaned closer, his jaw tightening. If this is what they're protecting, it's no wonder they're willing to kill for it. Just as Claire opened another folder, the cabin's lights flickered. Both of them froze. Hank, who had been resting on the floor, lifted his head and growled softly. "They found us," James said under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. Claire quickly pulled the USB drive from her computer and handed it to James. "Go," she urged. "I'll cover for you. Get this to someone who can bring them down." "I'm not leaving you behind," James argued, but Claire shook her head. "I can take care of myself," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. "The truth needs to come out. That's more important than either of us." James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Stay safe, Claire." With Hank at his side, James slipped out the back of the cabin and into the dense forest, the USB drive tucked securely in his jacket. He knew the conspirators wouldn't stop until they silenced him, but he also knew one thing for certain: he was no longer running blind. The pieces were coming together, and James was ready to fight back. The conspiracy had been unveiled, and now, it was time to bring it crashing down. The safe house was tucked away in the outskirts of a forgotten industrial town. It was a nondescript, weathered building that blended seamlessly with its abandoned surroundings. Inside, James sat at a rickety table with Hank lying at his feet. The USB drive was clutched tightly in his hand. Claire's last words echoed in his mind: "The truth needs to come out." The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. James's every nerve was on edge. He knew they'd come for him, it was only a matter of time. He had made contact with an ally, a trusted journalist named Eric Turner, who promised to meet him at dawn to take the USB drive. Until then, all he could do was wait. Suddenly, Hank's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled from his throat as he stared at the door. James grabbed his pistol, his pulse quickening. The first sound was subtle, a faint shuffle of footsteps outside. Then came the unmistakable clatter of a lock being tampered with. James extinguished the lamp and took position behind an overturned couch, his weapon trained on the door. Hank crouched low, ready to spring into action. The door burst open, and 3 figures in tactical gear stormed in, their movements swift and precise. Silenced weapons gleamed in the faint moonlight filtering through the cracked window. James fired the first shot, taking down the lead intruder before they could react. The sound of suppressed gunfire echoed through the room as bullets tore through the furniture. Hank lunged at the second assailant, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's arm and dragging him to the ground. Chaos erupted. James moved with calculated precision, firing at the remaining attackers while using the furniture as cover. One bullet grazed his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and kept fighting. He knew there was no room for hesitation, his life, and the secrets on the USB drive, depended on it. The third assailant threw a flashbang into the room. The explosion of light and sound disoriented James, sending him reeling. Hank yelped and scrambled back to James's side. Through the haze, James spotted the remaining intruder advancing toward him, a knife glinting in their hand. With sheer instinct, James grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it with all his strength, knocking the attacker off balance. He followed up with a well-placed shot, ending the fight. Silence fell over the safe house, save for James's ragged breathing and Hank's low growls. The floor was littered with the bodies of the attackers, their gear marked with no identifiable insignias. James quickly assessed the scene, knowing reinforcements could be on the way. He grabbed a small bag he had prepared earlier, containing the USB drive, extra ammunition, and a burner phone. "Let's go, Hank," he said, his voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. They slipped out the back door and into the night. James's mind raced as he plotted his next move. The safe house had been compromised, and it was clear the conspirators were growing desperate. He needed to reach Eric Turner, and fast. As he disappeared into the darkness with Hank by his side, one thing was certain, the fight was far from over. The enemy might be closing in, but James was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The cold night air bit into James's skin as he and Hank sprinted away from the compromised safe house. Behind them, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, a clear sign reinforcements were closing in. James's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he didn't have time to stop. Up ahead, a dilapidated warehouse loomed in the darkness. James had scouted the area earlier and remembered a hidden entrance to an old underground tunnel system that once served the industrial complex. It was risky, but it was their best shot at evading their pursuers. He reached the warehouse and pushed open a rusted side door, ushering Hank inside. The air inside was damp and thick with the scent of mildew. James flicked on a small flashlight and scanned the room, his eyes landing on a trapdoor partially concealed beneath debris. "Come on, boy," he whispered to Hank, who stayed close, his eyes darting toward every sound in the shadows. James shoved aside the debris and pried open the trapdoor, revealing a steep metal ladder descending into darkness. He climbed down first, his flashlight guiding the way, then whistled softly for Hank to follow. The dog hesitated for a moment before leaping down gracefully, landing beside James with a soft thud. The tunnel was narrow and suffocating, the walls lined with decaying bricks and dripping with moisture. The air was cold and carried the faint, metallic scent of rust. James moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He had no map, only a vague sense that the tunnel should lead to an abandoned train yard on the other side of town. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as they navigated the maze-like passage. The sound of their footsteps echoed ominously, blending with the distant rumble of water dripping into unseen pools. James's mind raced with questions. How had the safe house been discovered so quickly? Was there a mole within his limited circle of allies? Suddenly, a distant noise froze him in his tracks. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of boots on metal. They found the tunnel, James muttered under his breath, gripping his pistol tightly. He extinguished the flashlight, plunging them into complete darkness. "Stay close," he whispered to Hank, his voice barely audible. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the occasional muffled voice. James moved silently, feeling his way along the tunnel wall. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to stay calm. Every step brought him closer to what he hoped was the exit, and farther from the armed men closing in behind them. At a fork in the tunnel, James paused, his instincts screaming at him to choose quickly. He opted for the left path, guided by a faint draft of fresh air. As they moved, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Finally, they emerged into a wider section of the tunnel, where rusted tracks crisscrossed the floor. Up ahead, a faint glow of moonlight filtered through a grate, signaling the end of the tunnel. Relief washed over James, but it was short-lived. The sound of footsteps was now deafening. James turned just in time to see shadows moving rapidly toward them. Without hesitation, he fired a warning shot down the tunnel, the sound reverberating like a cannon blast. The pursuers momentarily hesitated, giving James and Hank the precious seconds they needed. Reaching the grate, James saw it was secured with a rusted padlock. He cursed under his breath and yanked out a crowbar from his bag, prying at the lock with all his strength. Come on, he hissed. The lock finally gave way with a loud snap. James shoved the grate open and climbed out into the open air, pulling Hank after him. They emerged in the overgrown remains of the train yard, the tall grass swaying in the wind. Behind them, shouts echoed from the tunnel. James slammed the grate shut and jammed a piece of metal into the latch to delay the pursuit. Breathing heavily, he looked around for cover. Spotting an old, rusted train car, he motioned for Hank to follow. They slipped inside, disappearing into the shadows. For now, they were safe. But James knew it was only a matter of time before the hunters closed in again. Clutching the USB drive, he vowed to stay one step ahead. The truth buried in its files was worth any risk, and he wasn't about to let the conspirators win. James and Hank barely had time to catch their breath before the sound of approaching vehicles broke the eerie silence of the abandoned train yard. Flashlights and barking orders pierced through the night as their pursuers closed in. The train car was no longer safe. James peered out through a crack in the rusted metal and saw figures spilling out of black SUVs, armed and moving with precision. They were professionals. Time to go, James whispered to Hank, who remained crouched at his side, ears perked and alert. With the USB drive secured in his jacket, James slipped out the back of the train car and scanned the horizon. Beyond the train yard lay a dense forest, its towering trees promising cover, but also danger. There was no other choice. The two darted into the treeline, their footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. James moved quickly but cautiously, weaving between the trees and avoiding obvious paths. The cold air was thick with the scent of pine, and the faint glow of moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above. Behind them, the sound of shouts and barking dogs grew louder. They had unleashed a tracking team. James cursed under his breath, his mind racing for a plan. He couldn't outrun trained dogs, not for long. Reaching a small stream, James paused. He knelt and splashed water over his boots and Hank's paws to mask their scent. This should slow them down, he muttered, though his heart pounded with uncertainty. The stream led to a rocky incline, and James followed it, each step a calculated effort to stay ahead of their pursuers. Hank moved silently beside him, his keen instincts keeping him in sync with James's every movement. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, its sharp crack echoing through the forest. James ducked instinctively, pulling Hank behind a boulder. A searchlight swept through the trees, cutting through the darkness like a blade. They're closing in, James thought grimly, his grip tightening on his pistol. He waited, his breath shallow, as the beam of light passed dangerously close. When the coast seemed clear, he motioned for Hank to follow and moved deeper into the forest. The terrain grew steeper, the trees denser. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, but James pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant certain capture, or worse. Then he heard it, the low growl of a dog, much closer than he had expected. Turning sharply, James saw a shadowed figure just a few yards away. A handler with a tracking dog had broken ahead of the group. Before the handler could react, James raised his pistol, firing a single, precise shot. The man crumpled to the ground, his dog barking furiously before retreating into the darkness. The noise would draw the others, but it bought James a few precious seconds. He turned and ran, his legs burning with the effort. Hank stayed at his side, his loyal companion refusing to falter. The forest thinned ahead, revealing a sheer drop into a ravine. James skidded to a halt, his heart sinking. The ravine was deep and jagged, a narrow river rushing far below. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the glow of flashlights cutting through the trees. With no time to hesitate, James spotted a fallen tree forming a precarious bridge across the gap. "We don't have a choice," he said to Hank, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. He stepped onto the tree, balancing carefully as it creaked under his weight. Hank followed, his movements agile but cautious. Halfway across, the tree shuddered violently as a bullet struck its base. James stumbled but managed to catch himself. He turned, firing blindly toward the flashlights in an attempt to buy more time. Another bullet whizzed past, and he pushed forward, urging Hank to hurry. They reached the other side just as the tree gave way, crashing into the ravine with a deafening roar. James collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant shouts of their pursuers. James knew they wouldn't give up. But for now, the forest had granted them a reprieve. Pulling himself to his feet, he glanced at Hank and gave a small, grim smile. "Come on, boy. We're not done yet." The forest stretched endlessly before them, dark and foreboding, but James squared his shoulders and pressed on. The truth on that USB drive was worth every risk, and he wasn't about to let anyone stop him. After hours of trekking through the dense forest, James and Hank found a momentary refuge in a secluded cave. The faint glow of dawn peeked through the canopy, casting a dim light on the jagged walls of their hiding spot. Exhausted but resolute, James retrieved the USB drive from his jacket pocket. Sitting on the cold stone floor, he powered up the small, rugged laptop he had salvaged from Hank's safe house. With every keystroke, his mind raced. He had risked too much to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden in the encrypted files. The decryption process was tedious, but James's focus didn't waver. Hank, ever vigilant, lay by the cave entrance, his sharp ears tuned to any approaching danger. Finally, the screen flashed, signaling success. Rows of documents, spreadsheets, and diagrams filled the screen, their complexity hinting at a web of conspiracy far larger than James had anticipated. His eyes darted over the contents, piecing together a narrative that chilled him to his core. The USB drive contained detailed blueprints for covert operations, coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure, assassinations of key political figures, and a chilling plan to destabilize entire governments. At the center of it all was a shadowy organization called Obsidian Veil, a name James had heard whispered in intelligence circles but never fully understood. "What the hell is this?" James muttered, scrolling through the files. Dates and locations were highlighted, some already marked as executed. The rest were imminent. One file in particular caught his eye, Project Echelon, labeled as Priority Alpha. Clicking it open, James's breath hitched. It detailed a plot to infiltrate and compromise global satellite networks, effectively seizing control of worldwide communications and navigation systems. The implications were staggering: air traffic chaos, disrupted supply chains, and the potential for global blackouts. "This isn't just a conspiracy," James said aloud, his voice tinged with urgency. "This is a declaration of war." He continued to dig deeper, uncovering names, aliases, and code words. Many of the operatives listed were high-ranking officials, CEOs, and military leaders. The reach of Obsidian Veil was vast, its members embedded in positions of power across multiple nations. Amid the overwhelming data, one name stood out: Senator Marcus Bellamy, a prominent politician with a spotless public reputation. According to the files, Bellamy wasn't just complicit, he was one of the masterminds, using his influence to shield the organization's activities and divert attention from their operations. James clenched his fists, his mind flashing back to encounters with the senator during his days as a federal agent. The man had always seemed too polished, too calculating. Now, the facade was crumbling, revealing a far more sinister reality. As James processed the information, Hank let out a low growl, snapping James out of his thoughts. He grabbed his pistol and moved to the cave entrance, peering into the forest. The faint sound of voices and the crunch of boots on leaves confirmed his fears. They were being tracked again. "We've got to move," James said, shutting down the laptop and tucking the USB drive securely into his jacket. But before they could slip away, a faint beep sounded from the laptop, a signal beacon. James's heart sank. The device had been compromised, likely emitting their location to whoever was hunting them. "Damn it," he cursed, slinging the laptop into his bag and securing it. The forest, which had once felt like a shield, now seemed suffocating. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs felt like a harbinger of danger. But James knew there was no turning back. The information he held could change everything, if he could stay alive long enough to expose it. He turned to Hank, his determination hardening. "We're not just running anymore, boy. We're taking this fight to them." As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the treetops, James and Hank disappeared into the wilderness, leaving their pursuers behind for now. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. James and Hank pushed deeper into the forest, their movements swift and calculated. Despite the physical exhaustion weighing on them, they couldn't afford to slow down. The information on the USB drive was too valuable, and the threat of Obsidian Vale was closing in faster than they could have anticipated. They reached a small stream, where James paused to take a breath and check their surroundings. The forest was eerily quiet now, the sound of the birds muted, as if the world itself had sensed their urgency. "We need to keep moving, but we can't go in blind anymore," James said, crouching by the water's edge. He washed his face, letting the coolness wash over him, but his mind was miles ahead, already plotting their next move. Hank, ever alert, drank from the stream briefly before circling around James, sniffing the air for danger. James pulled out the USB drive again, knowing he couldn't waste any more time. He found a fallen log, covered in moss, that provided a decent cover. Using his small handheld device, he set up a temporary shelter, just enough to stay hidden for a while. They had no choice but to lay low for the next few hours and regroup. James began reviewing the files again, focusing on the most pressing threat, Project Echelon. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible. To seize control of global communications and navigation would not only plunge the world into chaos, but it would also allow Obsidian Vale to dictate terms to every nation, corporate entity, and even the average citizen. A steady stream of cold dread filled James as he read further. He had seen his fair share of covert operations, but this was different. This wasn't about a handful of criminals trying to make a profit, it was about orchestrating a new world order, built on fear, manipulation, and violence. "We need to hit them where it hurts," James muttered to himself. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through options. Hank sat down beside him, sensing the tension in the air, as if he, too, understood the magnitude of what they were up against. James's eyes fell on the name of Senator Marcus Bellamy once more. A man who had built his career on promises of national security and progress, all while secretly pulling the strings behind one of the world's most dangerous organizations. The sheer hypocrisy made James's blood boil. He needed to take Bellamy down, but it couldn't be a simple hit. Bellamy's political reach was vast, and his connections made him nearly untouchable. James knew he needed allies. He couldn't take this fight on alone. "I'll need to contact old friends," James said, standing up and pacing. "People who still have eyes in the right places. Intelligence contacts, former colleagues." The plan was beginning to form, albeit a dangerous one. To bring down Obsidian Vale, James would need to expose the full extent of their network. He couldn't just go after Bellamy, he needed to unravel the entire operation, piece by piece, in a way that would bring their allies into the open, forcing them to turn on each other. But first, survival. James knew he had to keep moving. If they stayed in one place too long, they'd be found. The discovery of their location was inevitable, the signal beacon from the laptop had already given them away. He packed the USB securely again and turned to Hank, his resolve hardening. "We'll keep heading east. There's a safe house I can reach from there. Once we get inside, we can make our next move. We can't stop now." Hank barked softly, his tail wagging briefly in agreement. James couldn't help but smile, grateful for the dog's unwavering loyalty. They had been through too much together, and now they were standing at the edge of something far greater. James was already making mental notes, calculating their route. A safe house would only buy them a short reprieve, but it would give them a chance to gather intel, reach out for help, and prepare for the storm ahead. As he looked back one last time toward the direction they had come from, James knew that the true fight was just beginning. With every step forward, they were entering uncharted territory that would demand every ounce of his skill, his resolve, and his willingness to face the darkness of a conspiracy that threatened the world itself. "Let's go, Hank," James said, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as the cool wind swept through the trees. "We've got a war to win." And with that, they disappeared deeper into the wilderness, the weight of their mission heavier than ever. As the day wore on, the dense forest seemed to close in around James and Hank, but neither of them slowed. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger at every turn, but James knew there was no turning back. The decision had been made, and there was no retreating into the safety of the past. The stakes had grown higher than he'd ever imagined. His mind raced as he reviewed their options, their resources, and the tangled web they'd been pulled into. James had always been resourceful, but the weight of what they were about to face settled in with a sobering clarity. The enemies they faced were no longer just shadowy figures operating in the dark corners of society. No, Obsidian Vale was a machine, its tendrils reaching into every facet of government, business, and the very infrastructure of power. He could feel the urgency in his bones. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for the future. The world depended on the success of their mission. If they failed now, the consequences would be catastrophic. And the moment he thought about all those who would suffer, families torn apart, cities plunged into chaos, his determination solidified even further. Stopping for a brief moment to adjust his pack, James caught Hank's eye. The dog's gaze was steady, unwavering, trusting, as always. They'd come so far together, and James knew that Hank wasn't just a companion. He was a symbol of the resolve that had carried them through countless obstacles. They had made it through attacks, betrayals, and near-death encounters. Now, they were about to confront the true power of Obsidian Vale. James's mind flickered back to the faces of those they had uncovered: Bellamy, the senator, the hidden players in the intelligence community, the shadowy figures who would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. They were everywhere, and every second they spent hidden in the forest was another second the enemy had to regroup and strike back. "No more waiting," James said, more to himself than to Hank. He could feel the resolve building inside him, like a fire that had been kindling ever since they discovered the truth about Project Echelon. "We're going to hit them where it hurts. We expose them for who they really are, and we tear down everything they've built." The drive to end this nightmare had taken root in his heart. Each step forward was a commitment not just to himself or Hank, but to everyone who would be affected by Obsidian Vale's rise. It was no longer just about vengeance or justice, it was about redemption for a broken system, about reclaiming a world that had been manipulated for far too long. As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, James felt the weight of the moment. The quiet stillness of the woods around them gave way to an unmistakable feeling of finality. The end was coming, and he could almost taste it, the culmination of every hardship, every sacrifice, and every strategy they had put into place was leading them to this moment. They had come too far to fail. The last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now, it was time for action. James pulled out the map from his pack, examining the route that would take them closer to the city where Obsidian Vale's real power lay. "We'll hit them hard," he muttered, his voice low but filled with certainty. "Take down Bellamy, expose everything we know, and bring the whole damn thing crashing down. It ends tonight." Hank let out a low growl in agreement, as if he too understood the magnitude of what they were about to face. With one final glance at the dense woods around them, James turned and set off toward their destination. There was no more room for doubt, no more hesitation. This was their final stand. The future, their lives, and the lives of countless others depended on it. The battle for the world's freedom had begun, and James Carter was ready to see it through to the very end.